Josh, I'm going to turn things over to Josh Sullivan, who is going to be our moderator today.
I'm proud to introduce Elana Gordon. She is a reporter and producer at WHYY. Before that, she was working in Kansas City, if I'm correct, and right now she's in Cambridge as a Knights Fellow for Science Journalism. And she's working with a lot of really smart people over there, as far as I can tell. So she's going to talk to us a little bit about how she got into the field, and I guess we'll start off with that. Thank you for coming with us.
Yeah.
How did you get your start in public radio, and when you set out to be a reporter, was this the medium that you originally wanted to enter?
Yeah, I think the medium I found first, and then the reporting kind of came together pretty organically. So I was always like that kid in college that had a cassette recorder, if you remember that. So I'd like record my friends or something at birthday parties. And then I discovered the college radio station like my senior year of college, second semester. I was like, what is this? And I had a friend who was interning at a local public radio station, and I was really jealous, but I didn't really put things together that you could do that. So I had other jobs before getting into journalism. I worked at a health clinic for several years, and I think that was actually a really informative experience in kind of moving into what I love most, or one of the things I love most about this medium, was I spent a lot of time interviewing people and listening to people's stories. And I found myself really moved in these very intimate spaces at a health clinic, people sharing some of our most vulnerable moments have to do with our health, and there's something both universal but also can be very like stigmatizing about that. And then I just felt a certain power in that conveying and that storytelling. And so I went from there and made a transition into freelancing for a community newspaper and doing some stories at the local public radio station there, and then wound up making a transition. So I don't have a journalism degree per se. I kind of went about it in some different ways, but I am constantly seeking and have been, taking classes, and I love being a fellow this year to kind of take some time to step back to a certain degree to kind of reflect on how I report and what sort of tools and things I want to do better and learn. So that's kind of how I made my way into it.
So my next question was, how do you find yourself in the public health field, the science field, but you kind of started in that realm first, right?
Yeah, I did. So I think that I definitely found myself I wasn't necessarily actually like seeking out, like it kind of found me. I was doing a lot of community work, and I wound up getting a volunteer position and then working at this health clinic, and just kind of being so fascinated and interested both in like the very personal and then also in like these big picture ways of like how we get healthcare, how we take care of ourselves. And some of the bigger questions around that really have been a big driver in a lot of the stories and issues that I'm interested in. So yeah.
You sent me a piece making music and also having anxiety about MRIs. Do you want to play that right now?
Yeah, if you want to. So
Sure.
A little setup. Can I actually ask people a question?
Yeah, definitely.
So, okay.
You can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
The other guest.
Do people here listen to like public radio on the radio? All right. How often? Like once a day? Like once, like every couple weeks? What about podcasts? Yeah? Okay. Can I I'm curious, like what you all listen to. Like people kind of like throw some stuff out. What's like a favorite podcast or podcast? Anything? Yeah.
I own up to the Basement DR.
The Basement DR?
Basement DR. It's this YouTuber who does a podcast, Basement DR.
Uh-huh.
And it's kind of like a talk show, kind of like this program type thing. It's usually pretty funny.
Uh-huh. Cool. Anyone else got one? Cool.
Listen to The Dream.
Okay. I don't...
So it's by the reporter Jane Marie, it's like an investigation of multi-level marketing.
Sorry, investigation of...
Multi-level marketing conspiracies. Yeah, it's really good.
Okay.
The Dream. Yeah.
See, I'm just trying to find out what to listen to here, so.
Alexi, what about you? You had your hand up.
I was on the 538 politics a lot this midterms, but it's
Yeah.
What is heavyweight?
I just finished Bear Brook from New Hampshire Public Radio.
Oh, okay.
About the Bear Brook murders, and that was very good. Highly recommend it.
Awesome.
Not very light, a lot of murder, but very good.
Yeah.
Dr. Death. So that's about, I listen to all kinds of like investigation, true crime stuff. It's about a surgeon, a criminally terrible surgeon in
Oh,
Texas,
uh-huh.
Dallas, I think Dallas, who like caused severe harm to several patients. But like I like how people were trying and failing to stop him from practicing. It's good, but it's not good if you're sweet.
No, I always just like to get like a gauge of what people listen to. Like on the one hand, to say like when I got into public radio, I wasn't a huge listener, and I think we all listen to news in different ways. But also, it's like an open door to like encourage people, even if you don't necessarily like are using that as like something that you do listen to regularly. Like there's a lot of like I don't know, a lot of really cool opportunities and things. And yeah, with podcasting, there's so many like different ways that of storytelling and like humor and creativity and things like that. So, but I thought I might be late, so I like gave a piece just to listen to. But just a little bit of setup. So when I got to WHYY about 5 years ago, one of the things that we were talking about was launching a health and science show, because I was a health and science reporter in the newsroom doing like spots, which are like newscasts and like features, and we wanted to make a magazine style show, or like kind of a storytelling show that focuses on health and science issues. But we were kind of like experimenting with what to do. So this was like one of the first stories I did that aired on one of the earlier episodes. And it's a news show, but not like totally traditionally that way. So this was kind of like my experience of when, after about like 5 years of a radio station in Kansas City, where suddenly it was like, just try making try breaking some rules, or just like seeing what you kind of want to, like what comes of like some questions you have and what happens. So yeah, this was a segment on it.
It's sort of like being in a trash can while somebody is running a jackhammer.
It sounds like a washing machine with nuts and bolts in it.
It's just noisy. I don't
Everyone
know how
hear in
else
the back?
to describe it.
Well, louder, louder, louder.
The most important thing it requires is to be still. There's a lot of loud noises which sound strange, but I find when I hear the noises, they come with a certain beat, and it usually reminds me of some song. In fact, it's even possible with some creativity to make the sounds mimic a certain song. I'm professor of radiology, Thomas Jefferson University Hospital. An MRI is a method of getting pictures inside a body. It uses a magnet and it uses radio waves. So there are similarities in the physics of it to a radio that you'll listen to. But instead of detecting signals from a radio station and turning it into voice or music, this is using radio waves when a person is inside a magnetic field to make sophisticated images.
You still have about 20 minutes left.
When I'm in there, I just close my eyes and relax.
When I was in there, I panicked. I was just, stop, you gotta get me out of here, because the fact that I felt closed in, and the fact that the noise was just nothing that I had expected. I had to make them stop, and I didn't go back in. I regret the fact that I had to leave, because I'm trying to get better. I want to be free from this pain. I'm 65 years old and I have trigeminal neuralgia. It's a damage to the nerve in the face. They call this the suicide pain. It is so severe, that there has been times when people wanted to kill themselves. As time went on, I realized if I wanted to get healthy, I had to make sacrifices and let the fear just fade away.
It is the most effective and versatile method for looking inside a human body.
I'm trying to get my bracelet on. You have to be metal free when you go in to get the MRI. One thing I advise is to keep your eyes closed. Never, ever open them.
So you lie on a table and it slides you inside a cylinder.
I always keep my eyes completely closed because you don't want to see how close you are to that machine.
We are told not to move and not to speak while the scan goes on.
I pray, and I prayed my whole way through it.
What I did while I was in there the last time to get through it peacefully was to meditate.
Try to think of a journey that you're going through, something that you love to do. The sun coming through the ivy and the trees, the nature, you see the animals.
As thoughts come up, just letting them go, and as the sounds come up, just sort of let them be part of the breathing.
It will take away the anxiety.
It's a strange experience, but there's nothing to be scared about.
You can do this because the end result is for you to get healthy. My name is Tonia Morta.
I'm Dr. Donald Mitchell.
My name is Janet D. Simone.
My name is Jerry Whalen.
Yeah, so radio can be really fun. I don't know, I just like the that moment of realizing I feel like the human voice is so powerful and intimate. But also it's a medium, maybe out of insecurity that I didn't come from a print background of how can I exploit this medium in a way that other mediums can't. And so it's really fun to think about all the levels of emotion that you can capture and dynamics. And human feeling as well, and physiology as well as conversation and investigation. So I don't know, I just think that's a fun example. I also had to hang out outside of that MRI center when that woman got the MRI, and the woman the communications person had to go and wouldn't let me stay in there. And so I was hanging out outside hoping that Toniette would talk with me because I met her before. And then after, but we didn't have anywhere to talk, so we wound up going into a restaurant that hadn't opened yet, and they let us sit in the back of the restaurant where it was quiet. So I don't know, I just I like sharing that piece because on the one hand it was pretty different, but also at the same time it's not, I don't feel like it took any sort of extra fancy tools per se to do something like that. I had this recorder and then used some music of musicians inspired by MRI music and had some people record themselves on their iPhones, basically. So, yeah.
When you're going into the decision-making process, I mean, you're dealing with a very serious subject, a woman who has pain so harsh that some people end up committing suicide from it. Is it kind of a real risk to be I'm going to lighten this up a little bit, I'm going to layer some stuff over it? Kind of what's going through your mind, and what are the conversations you're having with other people while you're putting this together?
I think it can be subjective. So I think it's gauging different. We'll often have people listen to pieces before they air, kind of, and get some listener or some feedback from other people on the team. So I think it's kind of that balance of respecting the seriousness of something, but also creating kind of an experience of, hey, it's not just an MRI, but like a lot's at stake with these things. And so I think it's a subjective decision, but kind of trying to embody some of that experience or imagine that situation of here's a woman who hates going in there, doesn't, but yet a lot's at stake. So, yeah.
I want to go back to what you said, where you said all you had was your recorder. Didn't take any fancy tools or anything like that. I think a lot of people who are jumping into the medium might be a little bit taken aback because there are so many crazy things you can do to really make a piece stand out. But what are like the basics someone should have in their toolbox when they're getting started?
Yeah. So, so a little plug. Transom.org has really good basic write-ups and about like radio equipment and things like that. I think that if you Google certain things, you might get like ads like, this is the thing you need for your podcast or something, or here are the mics and the fancy things. And so there's a really good kind of resource for that sort of stuff. I think that ultimately, so this is a Marantz recorder. It's what a lot of like the people in like NPR use. I often will wear these and like people are like, what is that thing and what year is it from? But they're very, good sounding devices. There's cheaper, smaller ones. Like
What does that one cost, roughly?
I haven't looked up the latest, but it's probably like $600 or $700. This is probably like, I don't think they make these anymore. It's a Sony. I think like there's a Zoom now that's like an equivalent that's $100 or so. Some people, it's not necessarily ideal if you're trying to do a longer type of podcast, but iPhones have recorders now. I'll have, it's often instead of using phone tape, I'll have somebody on the other line talk to me on a phone and hold up their iPhone as a recorder and then send me that recording. And it can work pretty well with some coaching of like, don't move your hand when you talk, close the windows, turn off the vents, And actually, I think that brings up a point. I've often had people approach me, like really awesome journalists or people who are interested and like want to talk about getting the right lavalier mics, and those are good too. But all these sorts of things to kind of set it up so that you're not too intrusive when you're talking to somebody, let's say about something really intimate. And ultimately, like, it's all about just, like, I feel like you could just do a workshop on this, of just, like, you don't need fancy equipment. It's all about setting yourself up to get the best sound you can or the best moments. So if you're doing a one-on-one interview, the best equipment in the world is not going to, this vent sound that I'm hearing as a producer, like, I would go to a different room. I would go to a closet if I had to, And so it's kind of thinking about acoustics in that way and just setting yourself up. And, like, yeah, if you're at, like, a big event and I need to interview somebody for a segment, like, I may actually take them into a closet. Like, that's just kind of because that's the quietest place. Not ideal, but kind of fun. So it's like, it's often just like getting used to putting a mic in someone's face. And once you're comfortable, like, once I'm comfortable, you'll become comfortable. I just have to believe that, and it'll, like, happen. And so I sometimes wish there could be some, like, special exercise to how to get your arm, because your arm will start hurting holding that mic too long. I mean, that can be different than, like, in studio, but you can do a lot of amazing things on an iPhone too. It's just kind of like setting yourself up to have the best kind of interview experience. Or, a mic too is kind of like a camera lens. So if you're thinking about scenes or layering sounds, you can think about a very close-up in a camera lens, like a close-up of someone's foot if you're walking, or the door closing, or like kind of the pan, which is just the sound of the room of everybody talking or something. And so often there are like tricks in radio where, let's say, you're covering an event, like I don't have my like Pro Tools or Adobe Audition or Hindenburg or whatever program that you use, but like there's different layers of audio tracks. So you might like stand in a room, and I'm just gonna stand here, and it's something called ambi, which is like the sound of something, and I might just stand here for like a minute and get like the sound of the room, and then I'll put that in one track. and then I might go like interview somebody in a quieter spot, or if I have to interview somebody in that spot, then I have some kind of underlying sound to kind of like cue your ear, like where we are and what's happening. And then maybe like there's a sound of the door or something at a certain point that kind of signposts or accentuates something, a moment happening in the room, maybe when somebody important comes in. I don't know. So there's just different ways to like use a very basic mic or other things. I actually like don't even use what's often called a shotgun mic, ones that go really, like, I've done a lot of like interesting sound designy things and sound rich things for public radio. I mean, not necessarily certain types of like podcasts-ish. And it's really what you're thinking, like what you imagine you want something and how you want to collect certain sounds. That's been my experience. So.
Do you have any tips for someone who's looking to get out of the box a little bit as far as collecting ambient sound? I mean, anyone can, if you're walking down the street, anyone can just hear like horns beeping and stuff like that, but what's something that might add a really good layer?
I mean, it kind of depends on what you're trying to do. Like, there's definitely like cliches in radio. Like, I've had an editor be like, no more school bells in the school piece, you know? But I once did recently a radio workshop, and we did a really fun exercise, which was, and you could try this with a friend, which was one person's blindfolded and is holding the recorder with a mic, headphones on, and another person's leading them around and having you pointing to things, and you have to guess what you're listening to. And I remember I guided a friend. We were near a bar, but it was midday, and somebody was typing, and I remember like bringing the friend in, and you could hear like someone pouring a pitcher, and then the typing sound was like really confusing to her. But it's all to say, it's a really powerful exercise to realize how many sounds are around you and like kind of a mindful listening to the environment. And so these little things that like you might not think are a big deal, like can be, and often it depends on what sort of scene you're trying to get. So I'm trying to think of a recent one, because I love getting good tape and sound. And it's sometimes just kind of being in the moment. So recently, before I came to Boston, one of the most recent projects I worked on was going to Vancouver and reporting on drug use there, and specifically supervised injection sites, which is something that is being debated in the United States as a form of, for people who are injecting illicit drugs, and there's a lot of overdoses. These are spaces where people would use drugs under medical supervision. And so I remember going to one of these places, but I couldn't go into the main one while people were in there to record. It was just not going to happen. There were a lot of like privacy concerns. Also, what's great though with radio is like you can get into all sorts of places because a mic is way less intimidating than a camera, and takes less setup. But anyway, so I was in there and I was trying to figure out what's the sound here, and some guy like threw his body against the window at one point, and this is in the story because I'm inside getting a tour of this empty space. I'm like, what's sound here? What are we, it's just like echoey, you're walking, like sound of supplies, you showing me supplies. But then the program manager kind of laughed, and like there was kind of this exchange because this was somebody who comes to the center, and he was kind of saying hi. It was like this funny exchange, and the program director like waved at him, laughed, and I was like, what was that about? And then he kind of explained, but it actually was a bigger moment about like, to me as an outside observer, I was like very taken aback, like, ugh. And then it was actually like this moment of like genuine connection between these two people, and kind of showed, and I use that as a way to show kind of the space that this is, that people feel comfortable, and there are these like connections between like the people who are at the facility and the people who are using drugs, and like the kind of what that space means in that community. So I don't know if that's a helpful example, but like in radio, you don't need like the big sound, you just need these kind of moments that can kind of move you from one thing to a next. But big sounds are cool too, I don't know.
Is there anything you listen to train your ears? I was at the Harvard Sound Convention a couple weeks ago, and a lot of people were like, you can have all these fancy tools, but it doesn't really matter if you can't hear what's good and what's bad. So do Do you have any tips for training your own ears?
Always wear your headphones. So that's like the main thing, because if I'm recording, right, I want to hear what I'm going to hear when I'm back at my desk and my computer. So I always want to have these on. Sometimes I go like this. But like I always want to be able to hear what's being recorded, because that's going to tell me what sound is. I might not notice that vent or something, or I might not notice something, but I'll hear it more sharply in here. And you might pick up on things in that way. But I think that also just like comes with trying things, just having fun, like getting out there and trying to record things.
It seems like everybody has a podcast, or at least everyone starts like 3 episodes of a podcast, right? But what's something where you can make yourself stand out if you're kind of starting from scratch, if you're using equipment from the studio here, or if you're in your closet in your dorm room? What's something that can make it? I mean, I guess an easy answer is like making sure it goes more than 3 episodes, but.
I guess that's a hard question. I mean, I think it depends on who. A big question, I think it comes from like design thinking, but like a lot of people making new podcasts now and sponsoring them often ask this question: who's your audience? So who are you making this podcast for? And if the purpose is that you want to make a podcast for yourself, then you've succeeded. If you want to make a podcast for the floor of your dorm, and people on your dorm listen, and it like does something for that space, that's success too. So I think a good question potentially is like, who's this podcast for? And sometimes that can change. Why am I making this podcast, or what is this podcast about? For me, successful podcast stories and things, there's a balance. On the one hand, it's like, I don't remember who said this quote, but like, wish I had time to write you a shorter letter. Sometimes less is more. Oh, sorry? Cicero. I think in podcasts, like, oftentimes some of my best pieces, I've had an editor cut stuff out that I didn't want to be cut out. But ultimately it made it tighter, and it made it, as a listener, something that I wanted to hear. In radio or in audio, as a listener, it's linear, and so if you throw a lot of things in or tangent, I may not necessarily be able to keep following along in certain ways. So I think that thinking about length is interesting. For podcasts, I tend to really like ones like 99% Invisible or Criminal that kind of fall into like a 20-minute framework, but I've also heard amazing hour-long episodes of things, and I've heard amazing 5-minute ones too. That can be really hard. I mean, that piece was like 5 minutes or something, and so maybe it could have been shorter. So I think it's like thinking about those sorts of things, and obviously there's a difference between like a two-way talk podcast, like a conversational interview style one, and a very produced one as well, or a mix. So those are just some things to think about in terms of like, but then within, I often think that, so within The Pulse, which is the show that I've worked on, personal stories are really important, like the narratives of like, so there are like, the tagline is like people and places at the heart of health and science. And so a lot of the things that we think about and what makes a pulse story is like, who's at the center of the story, who's the character, who's kind of driving this narrative, who can listeners kind of like connect with or follow along with. I sometimes in like, I absolutely love This American Life, but I often think that, so I mean this in a good way, but I often find that like what makes often a story really good is like the very simple move of like, you're listening, you're like, I was not expecting that. And then this other thing happened, you're like, whoa, I was not expecting that. And then this other thing happens, and you're like, oh my God, I was not expecting that. So like an element of surprise is like, I think, a very powerful tool in storytelling. And sometimes when I think about that, that can change the structure, because you don't necessarily want to give everything away in the beginning, depending on the format. Now, obviously, like a news story on the newscast of some like thing that just happened, like who, what, where, when, why, tell me now. So there's different spaces and forums that make sense to do a certain approach, and certain approaches make more sense in other spaces.
Does anyone have any questions?
When you're pitching, kind of what does that look like specifically for
Yeah. Yeah, so for WHYY, and I think we have something, I'm happy to look it up and send it to you for the polls as an example. You often want to have like some specific, like you want to know that somebody's done some research, and I'm less interested in like an issue as much, and the show takes a variety of kinds of stories. Some are reported, some are just like a personal story, or somebody that has had an experience that relates to health or science. So that's very general. But the show is shifted into being themes, so sometimes it depends on whether that fits into a theme. So, I mean, having, I don't know that this is like super specific or helpful, but like having some like character or person or people at the heart of something, and some sense of like, some journey that has to do with that, and some sort of sense of what are like the sound or audio opportunities within that. I'm really hesitant to like quite say it's not about, like, to me, great scene. Like there's scene, like, look, I'm in this room and there's this like argument or there's a scene happening. But in radio, like a scene can be really powerful if somebody recounting a story too. Like it's a very visual, like our imaginations can like do a lot when we're listening. So, so I think like there's just a variety for something like The Pulse. But in addition, or within the framework of a really cool story about a health clinic or a policy, or like what happens when the dispensary opens for marijuana in Boston, like at the crux of that, there's a newsiness, but like who are the people that you might be main characters in the story? Is there somebody that's trying to like, you know, for different reasons, like trying to go to that dispensary, or is it like the owner, or is it something like? So I don't know if that's helpful. Another plug is that so Third Coast is a collection of it's a amazing resource for anybody at any stage in radio or audio or podcasting. And there's a lot of resources on that website. But in addition, there are these conferences every year, and there are pitch panels where people live pitch stories to all sorts of podcasts. And so you can actually go and look up these like lessons of lectures or panels, and like literally like 101 learn all these amazing techniques from like the best radio makers and storytellers out there by looking up some of these things that are online for free. So Third Coast is a really good resource also. I think AIR, the Association of Independent Radio Producers, also comes out with like pitch tips, and different shows will like submit, here's what makes a good pitch for our show. You know, and so another aspect of when you're pitching a story somewhere is like knowing the show or the type of stories that they're looking for, having like listened or talked to somebody about it, so that you kind of know what might potentially make a good fit for that place. Yeah.
So you said that making audio is easier than making video.
Well, I didn't. Yeah.
Because you don't have like the added element of camera. Mm-hmm. But I still find it hard because like you do so much of my microphone. So,
sure.
I'm curious if you have any tips for like how to equip people like you who are uncomfortable in front of the mic, or like what you do to create a natural setting.
Yeah, so I don't know if people heard. So the question was like, how do you, and again, I wasn't trying to, like, I haven't done enough. I'm super interested in video as well. I just know that, like, for setting up lighting and everything else, like with radio, you just kind of go right in. But the question was about how do you kind of have people be comfortable. And so one of the first things that you do when you are interviewing somebody is you want to test the levels, like how somebody sounds with a microphone. And so often the question, a common one from radio producers, is what did you have for breakfast? And for some reason that question actually really puts people at ease. I mean, that's a very basic thing. I think that beyond that, because I have no shame, you know, putting a mic in someone's face now, whether it's like, you know, you or like the president of like a university or an executive at a hospital, like we're just going to get really like close to each other right now. But I think if somebody's nervous, I think the question is to ask yourself or to ask or try to figure out like what, maybe it's not the mic of why somebody's nervous, and maybe think about why might this person be nervous right now? What are some things, maybe they're concerned about being recorded. Maybe they're concerned about what the story is. Maybe they're concerned about like what is it that I'm trying to do or what. So I think kind of also kind of opening up to understand why a person might be nervous. If it's just because oh, I've never done a radio interview before, like I'll often just be like, don't worry about it. It's not live, so I get to edit this, and so and that can be really freeing for people to feel like what they're saying is not directly going into a story or on air or something, but kind of talking about some of the ways that what concerns people might have. I don't ask somebody if they're concerned about something. In the same way, when I worked at a health clinic, I didn't necessarily ask, like, are you worried about this or this or this? I kind of wait for people to tell me what they might be concerned about. And often it might be something I wasn't expecting. Or, you know, or even maybe somebody's like, you know, this is, I'm nervous because this is, like, something I haven't talked about in a while. Or how, like, I'm concerned about coming off this way. And you just kind of talk that through. And for me, the most important thing is just also being kind of honest about like what I'm doing here and what kind of the purpose of me asking certain questions, that's why somebody might be nervous. Like, obviously it depends on the interview and who you're interviewing, but like maybe if it's a really tough or sensitive experience, like, you know, I'm asking this because the reason I'm asking some of these sensitive questions are, you know, it's like I think it's, you know, you have an important story, or like, listeners might find this to be really important or be able to get it. But yeah, I don't know if that helps. Or just like start asking questions, start talking, and keep talking, you know, or keep having a conversation until somebody might be nervous in the beginning and then like forget, you know, and 10 minutes in, loosens up. That's another thing. Sometimes people feel like, you know, especially with scientists, or like might feel like I want to make sure that you understand their research and kind of get things out, and just like I just will like listen, and they'll be like, okay, just to wrap up, so can we summarize, or is it like this? And then they'll just like way more nonchalantly and conversationally talk about things. Because for me in radio is an intimate space. I'm interested in getting the facts, but like I can tell you the facts, but I can't like tell you the excitement or the emotion or the process in a way that somebody who's working on something can. And so it's in those moments of like, sometimes it's after an interview when somebody feels like it's over that people loosen up, but you've got your recorder there, and like some of the best kind of moments or insights may come in that time too. So I don't know if that's helpful. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so it depends on the assignment, but like let's say some people use track markers. I've never done that, but you can sometimes on certain recorders, like I'm constantly like listening. So if I'm on deadline for a story, hopefully I will have thought about what I would imagine that story to be before I go out. Often a really important exercise and thing is to like kind of write your lead sentences before you go, and the ideal things you'd like to get, and what you think they're going to say. And that doesn't mean that you're like writing it and contriving like what it is, but once you kind of have that framework, then you have the flexibility to know when something changes, but you're already like looking for things that would fit well in a framework, because you're setting yourself up to do a lot of work, a lot more of extra work, if you don't have that idea in mind of what you think the story is before you go out. But I hold this notebook, so as an example, I was doing at a radio workshop an exercise called Vox, and Vox is when you go out and you interview like man on street things. And after each one, I would write down the track number from what file that was, the person's name, and like what stood out to me from that. And so when I get back and I've talked to like 12, 15 people in my head swimming, I can go back and look through, and if I'm on deadline, I can literally, and often what will happen is I might make a note, let's say it's an interview or I'm on deadline, and there's something important that was said, like I'll make a note of like literally at 15 minutes and 56 seconds, this person said this, that sounds like something I would want to put in this story, in this space. And then, you know, depending on how much time, often what a process when you're for radio is you often interview people, or you collect your sound, you go back, you go through it, and you log it. And logging is really important. That means you're literally transcribing what you have. It's a really humbling experience often. I'll come back and listen to like meetings or events and totally pick up on things in a different way, which is just interesting the way like we listen and we interpret anyway. But so sometimes you don't have time to like go through and log everything if you're on deadlines. So that practice of making notes of what it is that stands out in those files, and even like having a short list. Sometimes like you can't be recording and writing at the same time, but I'll just kind of like make mental notes. Or if you get back after deadline and you see a colleague and you're just like, and this goes for when you're not on deadline and when you are, but you want to tell your friend or something like this thing that happened, or like you start telling this story or this anecdote and you don't think that it's like much, but it's like the thing you keep talking about or the first thing that comes up. Often, like those are actually the moments and important moments that wind up you wanting to have in your piece. So like going to this facility in Vancouver, and I was like, yeah, and this guy just like ran up. It was like, you know, and like threw himself against the window to say hi, and then I'm like, oh wait, oh interesting, you know, and so that wound up becoming a moment. Yeah. Hey.
I have like kind of two questions.
Yeah.
Hopefully you might have answered the first one before I got here, but you mentioned about not necessarily having a print background and going into audio. So a little bit about your background and why, I guess, the audio side and how it was, I guess, the learning curve and what kind of things you went through, good and bad and all that. And then the second part is about music when you record, how you go about possibly recording live music or grabbing sound from live music, or you mentioned about having a friend collect sound from their iPhone. So which ways, like what are the different stories or scenarios where you would use live sound that you've got, that you grab, rather going to a friend and having them record themselves?
Oh, I see. Okay, so no, that's totally fine, and feel free to follow up. Or so I think that so I'd done some writing and had some radio experience, but maybe this is like the biggest thing with so getting into public radio, and it was like kind of sink or swim. And I think that's like probably the biggest lesson is like you just have to do it and like keep doing it, and whether it's for yourself or for like a podcast that you start, or for an internship, or for working at a station, like the practice of like trying to make something every week or like every month or whatever is really like that's the learning that's the biggest learning process. And I mean I think you could probably translate that to print and other things too, but for radio I feel like just the discipline, or the like feeling like I don't know what I'm doing but I have to do it, and that like I have to do it like is like one of the most important things when you don't feel fully prepared. Like I don't know when I ever feel fully prepared for something or fully researched or anything. It's just having to throw yourself in there and just try it and make it and do it and keep doing it. And I think that might be like an overly simplified answer to what you're saying, but that's one of the biggest things. It's really important to find mentors too, and that's been really helpful. So I was really lucky when I started working at the public radio station in Kansas City. I was around some really amazing journalists, some of the best storytellers and radio makers I know, and so just sometimes through osmosis I was like, how do I do what they do? So it's also like listening and kind of picking up on things, and obviously like there's a lot of just like resources out there and tools to look up to then just try and like keep trying and having good kind of feedback too from people you trust, or even reaching out to somebody and say, hey, I'm really interested in this, like, you know, can I get your feedback or something like that too. I don't know if that kind of helps or answers your question. I mean, one of the things I wish I knew in college or whatever is like, yeah, like there are internships. There are paid internships now in public radio and NPR and everything else. And so just as like a little bit of a deviation from your question, I've had a lot of people ask me this, like my parents don't get this, but it might be useful for like thinking about how public radio works. I mean, like podcasts, there's like private company networks and things like that. But so I work at KCUR in Kansas City and WHYY in Philadelphia. And then there's NPR, right, National Public Radio. And how the public radio system works is there's different radio stations peppered all throughout the country. And they're actually independent entities. They're separate. And then they pay for NPR programming. And NPR National is like this big umbrella, but they're actually separate entities. And so within that, then reporters and producers can like report stories and then like pitch up or file up to the national as well. But like when you're listening to WBUR or WGBH in Boston, you're hearing reporting here layered in with the national reporting. And so I say that because there's some really cool partnerships and collaborations that are going on that often create a lot of opportunities to learn, but also to kind of expand on the kind of reporting that people can do. So I was in a healthcare collaborative, healthcare reporting on the state. So when I was in Kansas City, I was also talking with reporters from around the country from these other stations, and we were talking about how to cover the rollout or the debates over the healthcare law, the Affordable Care Act. And we all learned different things from each other, and then also created this whole series of national reporting too around that. I feel like I deviated a little bit. But in terms of sound, I think it depends on, I'm probably not the best person to ask about like recording live music, because I think that gets in, and it depends on what you're trying to do. But I've like been in a church and heard like music that I wanted to use, and I like go up front and I'm like, I'm not sure if this works. And then I like run up to the balcony and see if that works, or then like I run to like the middle. So I think it's also just kind of trying things, and maybe trying things from different vantage points. I've had huge successes and huge fails. I might not be the best person to ask. Sometimes it can depend on the microphone, but also being mindful of like how loud it is listening into your headphones as well.
Do we have any more questions?
Was there,
One more. Do you want to show the video that Ira Glass?
has anybody seen this Ira Glass video that's basically like, do you show? Okay.
Yeah.
It's so no. I have to look at this and be like, right, okay. Or it's just this thing that he says that I find to
Nobody tells people who are beginners, and I really wish somebody had told this to me, is that all of us who do creative work, like, you know, we get into it, and we get into it because we have good taste. But it's like there's a gap. That for the first couple of years that you're making stuff, what you're making isn't so good. Okay, it's not that great. It's trying to be good. It has ambition to be good, but it's not quite that good. But your taste, the thing that got you into the game, your taste is still killer. And your taste is good enough that you can tell that what you're making is kind of a disappointment to you. You know what I mean? A lot of people never get past that phase. A lot of people at that point, they quit. And the thing I would just like say to you with all my heart is that most everybody I know who does interesting creative work, they went through a phase of years where they had really good taste. They could tell what they were making wasn't as good as they wanted it to be. They knew it felt short. It didn't have this special thing that we wanted it to have. And the thing I would say to you is everybody goes through that. And for you to go through it, if you're going through it right now, if you're just getting out of that phase, you got to know it's totally normal. And the most important possible thing you could do is do a lot of work. Do a huge volume of work. Put yourself on a deadline so that every week or every month you know you're going to finish one story. Because it's only by actually going through a volume of work that you're actually going to catch up and close that gap. And the work you're making will be as good as your ambitions. In my case, like I took longer to figure out how to do this than anybody I've ever met. It takes a while. It's going to take you a while. It's normal to take a while, and you just have to fight your way through that. Okay?
I like that, actually. That was pretty good.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. All right, well, thank you very much.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, if